Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our lecture series. My name is Mehrdad Hadigi. I'm the head of the Department of Architecture. This is our third lecture of this fall semester. And I'm here to welcome you and also welcome our dear guest, Mark Wigley. Welcome, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the lecture. And I'm going to pass the Zoom baton to my colleague, Pep Avilés, who will do the introduction. Enjoy the lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mehrdad. I guess you are familiar already with the format. There will be some Q&A questions that you can submit in the chat, and you can join and partake the conversation after Mark Wigley's lecture. So, you know, I'm Pep Avilés. I'm assistant professor here at the Department of Architecture, the Stuckeman School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture. And I would like to thank Mark Wigley for his presence today, and despite the circumstances and the difficulties, I can't think of a better medium than a screen-mediated lecture to illustrate Wigley's relentless advocacy for a renewed understanding of space and its consequences. Wigley used an image that Ferdinand Léger published in Cahiers d'Art in 1931 to illustrate one of the chapters in his 1993 groundbreaking publication, White Walls, Designers' Dresses. The image, perhaps a photomontage, sends a powerful message. New York as seen by Léger. In it, Léger appears in the foreground, looking at the camera situated above his head, as if he was about to utter a very important announcement from the actual underworld of the modern avant-garde. In the background, however, there's somehow a puzzling urban scene of a New York structure that is hard to interpret. It is unclear if what we see is a demolition site or is a construction site. Maybe it is both. But the ambiguity helps me to point out that something specific about Wigley's work. One could easily picture Wigley's face in that photomontage instead of Léger's and fantasize about the scene behind to state that his scholarship on architecture is both demolition and construction. I would argue that Wigley has followed a determined, persistent, and even stubborn path through his career that took him from the skin to the environment, from the accessory or superficial, the architectural parergon, to the immaterial, just to decisively declare that only at the margins and blind spots one can find the actual structural elements of architecture. His has been a scholarship of disobedience to an ossified discipline parroting outdated canons. Not by coincidence, his subjects of study are unlike others seen in more conventional histories of architecture. Grapevine structures, prosthetic hands, radio transmitters, bat suits, TV sets, commercials and catalogs, etc. Some of the objects from which Wigley's academic interrogation to architecture take a larger, more significant and proactive dimension. He began exploring these locations, fragments, attachments, screens, surfaces, only to continue with all kinds of no longer alien phenomena to our field, since this journey from skin to the environment has taken a unique shortcut in the last 2 decades. As anyone interested in Wigley's work will notice, he has developed an undisguised and morbid preference for wireless networks, electromagnetic fields, radio waves, and other non-material phenomena, or in other words, for the technological tectonics, the actual physics that rendered the spatial offspring of media as distinctive of our times. Isn't space about physics? Or put it differently, his scholarship has brought to the fore the aspects of space design that might not seem so evident for an always conservative and stultified field. It also might be evident for anyone interested in his work that in recent years, his attention has geared towards seemingly peripheral figures whose contribution didn't echo the architecture discourse of modernism, but whose work instead hold the promise of a radical reconfiguration of the coordinates in which architecture will navigate in decades to come. Those figures include Buckminster Fuller. By the way, if you haven't seen him impersonating Buckminster Fuller, please try to find a video on YouTube. It's phenomenal. So I was saying Buckminster Fuller, Gordon Bataclar, Constantine Nieuwenhuis, and Konrad Wachsmann, just to name a few, figures on the margins of the field, and I'm quoting here, bringing its blind spots to the fore. These names respond to the pattern of the anti-architect, the character capable of dissolving the very idea of building, and indicate new paths in space organization. If, as Buckminster Fuller argued, a building might be just energy and motion in space, we need to be equipped with different tools and metrics to face the consequences. Eventually, as much as architecture appears in Wigley's scholarship grounded in all forms of unconventional and uncomfortable questions haunting contemporary culture, it is also a form of hesitation, to use his own words, a state of suspension meant to stimulate future generations of architects and scholars. Wigley's scholarship is here just to reveal what is in plain sight. And that is the morbid pleasure I referred to a few lines above in relation to his body of work. His is a scholarship towards dematerialization in architecture that responds to a blessing and a curse. A curse for those still preoccupied with walls and ceilings, windows and doors, foundations and roof as we know them, and a blessing for those understanding space as an always dynamic and expanded field. If I have a resentment about Wigley's scholarship, is that his publications, lectures, talks, etc., do not come with a warning, maybe in the form of flashing lights, with alarm sounds or tags like the ones that classify certain chemicals as toxic or nuclear sites as health hazard, because his work is indeed as inspirational as nuclear, or at least has been for me. And I would like to thank Mark in that respect. Those warnings should prevent those young and easily susceptible minds that might be confused about the status of an otherwise service industry in an academic environment. After becoming familiar with Wigley's theoretical framework, the unwary student/scholar might be even more disoriented in the rabbit hole of architecture and might find that design does not mean what she previously thought. But more importantly, she might be adrift about herself and the purpose of her design actions. And as it happens with every good theory, there's no way back. You can unread it, you can unlisten to it. The questions remain. Now, just a quick, boring formality. Mark Wigley is Professor of Architecture and Dean Emeritus at Columbia University. He's a historian, theorist, and critic who explores the intersection of architecture, art, philosophy, culture, and technology. His books include Konrad Wachmann's Television Post-Architectural Transmissions, published in 2020, Passing Through Architecture, The 10 Years of Gordon Mataclar, 2019, Cutting Mataclar, an Architecture Investigation, published in 2018, Are We Human? Notes on an Archaeology of Design, written with Beatriz Colomina and published in 2016, Buckminster Fuller, Inc., Architecture in the Age of Radio, published in 2015, Constance New Babylon, The Hyper-Architecture of Desire, published in 1998, White Walls, Design Addresses, The Fashioning of Modern Architecture, published in 1995, and The Reader's Hunt, The Architecture of Deconstruction, published in 1993. He has created exhibitions at the Museum of Modern Art, the Drawing Center, Columbia University, with the DeWitt Center for Contemporary Art, Honorary Institute, and the Canadian Center for Architecture, among other places. And in addition to his impressive collections of publications and achievements, I would mention that he has been the relentless whip of the so-called post-criticality, that his work is among the most coherent and focused of a generation of scholars that partook of the different waves of theory impacting the architecture in this country in the last decades. Please help me welcome Mark Wigley.
So, Pep, thanks so much for your very generous words. A bit scary too, because you seem to know more about me than I do. By the way, if I knew what I was doing, why would I do it? So I felt like I was listening to a shrink. And if I would choose a shrink, actually, Pep, I would go with Pep because I admire his work a lot. And you could hear that, the thoughtfulness in the introduction. I don't know if I can match this description, but your description unnerves me enough that I try to pretend anyway that I fit this very generous description. But Pep, what you said so super clear and so well, I think, is why this obsession with these anti-architects? Why somebody that teaches architecture in an architecture school and normally professional architects? Why would a professional architect want to hear about an anti-architect? Or for those of you students and colleagues at Penn State, why spend our time listening to what seems to be the enemy? By the way, that's already an answer, right? If it's the enemy, you'd be an idiot if you don't pay attention to the enemy. And I don't think there are idiots at Penn State. So maybe you're just listening to me in order to kind of get a better sense of the enemy. And if I'm talking about Vaxman, I might be, as was hinted a little bit by Pep, your enemy. And yeah, wouldn't that be great if that was true? And wouldn't that be a kind of description of why the university can be a great place, that you could actually confront, as it were, the deepest threat to the very discipline that you love. And by the way, we love, right? Architects, we love buildings. And love is the word you use when you can't stand, you're very sad when you're not with something, but you don't know why. If you knew why, you wouldn't use the word love. So love means you don't know. So architects you could almost come up with a working definition. The architect is the only person in society that doesn't know what a building is, but stays close to it, trying to understand why they like to be with this thing that's not clear. It's not such a tricky thing to say. Surely a painter is somebody that loves painting and spends their entire life painting to try to understand what is the nature of this warmth or attraction or excitement. So maybe I'm starting to answer again my own question, because if we don't really know what it is that we love about architecture, and we meet somebody that really seems to take apart everything that we thought we knew, like I would say Konrad Wachsmann, maybe it helps us to sort of tune into what attracted us to architecture in the first place. So Waxman might be the figure that dissolves or challenges all of our assumptions, but also might be a kind of friend, in a sense, in helping us to sort of rethink or reassert or just defend architecture against these kind of moves. I think you're going to have trouble defending yourself against Vaxman. So I'm just giving you a warning. This would be the flashing lights that Pip talked about. Let me share the screen. So do you see the name of the lecture? I'm assuming
yes, we do.
Okay, great. So it's the same name as the title of this little book that I did with Sternberg Press, which was based on just a really lucky moment of time in which I could spend kind of half a year in the archives of this guy, Konrad Wachsmann, and really a guy. And you see him here very young. And you see, of course, Einstein on a bicycle. And you see Einstein's hair is sort of understood to be the very image of intelligence, and even the angle of the bicycle, and even the smile. This is our image of a super intelligent person. And here's Vaxman. You see him, a student, just recently graduated, very, very young, very sort of fragile, very well put together, looking at us not so securely. And he's making this house for Einstein. So one of the reasons that people get to know about Vaxman is everybody thinks Einstein's amazing. So if you're a young architect who made the summer house for Einstein, you might be amazing too. And indeed, it's the case. And you see that they like each other. You can see you can see that Vaxman, as a very young architect, is kind of modest and shy. And there's an intimacy there. You see it also in their kind of shared signing of this document about this house that Vaxman has made. But this is the Vaxman that kind of dominates. Very, very hard to find an image of Vaxman without a cigarette, right? It's almost as if he thinks with a cigarette or thinks that he has to think. And look at this image. It's a kind of little bit annoying image, a sort of macho image. Actually, he's trying to check out this material for making the joint for a project that he's working on. So he's trying to convey to you, no architect gets photographed by accident. He's not accidentally being caught in the forge where these are being made. He's wanting to communicate the sense that he's intimately connected with the pieces that put architecture together. Those are those pieces. So you see them there making a joint that would allow 21 different tubes to be connected at any angle. Konrad Wachsmann is most famously the expert of joints. Architects generally love Konrad Wachsmann because they think anybody that's an expert in putting things together must be, as it were, holding architecture together. So if you love tectonics or structure, you think this is the savior. What I'm going to try to show is actually this expertise in joints that Wachsmann had was actually a way of undoing architecture. This is that amazing joint. Totally remarkable. The history of Wachsmann, the career of Wachsmann is a series of joints. And this is a joint he designed in 1950. Notice that it has a hole in the middle of it. And he would always insist that at the center of every joint is a hole. So a joint is a kind of wrapper that goes around a hole, and then you add elements to it. So be careful already. This person who's supposedly holding architecture together is actually saying that architecture is not built on the ground, but is built around a series of holes, what he would call points in space. So imagine, if you will, a kind of network of points in which, and the structure is exactly the one that's behind me now, the kind of gossamer weave of structure, which is actually a set of points that have been linked by the thinnest, most portable material possible. Also, this is a joint that can be assembled with one hammer and taken apart with another hammer. So it doesn't require any special expertise. Every joint is the same, as with the same material, but it can, as I said before, can connect anything. What Waxman is arguing is the perfect joint would be ever more small. So if I could join more and more things ever more finely, eventually architecture would start to disappear. He was very much an admirer of his good friend, Buckminster Fuller. And Fuller said, we need to do more and more with less and less until everything can be done with nothing. And like Buckminster Fuller, ultimately, Waxman thought that architecture should disappear, should become nothing, should become invisible. This is what I mean about the fact that he's an anti-architect. He was a student of some of the most influential designers of Germany in the 1920s, but then in the 35 years after the war, spent all of his time dedicated to the disappearance of architecture. And he did this by turning architecture against itself, right? An anti-architect is not simply opposed to architecture, but is using architecture to undermine itself. Architecture is, if you like, for Waxman, a stockpile of stupidity. It is all about divisions, inequities, and lack of opportunities. So architecture needs to go. It needs to exit as quickly as possible. But like in a kind of a theater, this exit needs to be designed. Architecture has to, as it were, orchestrate its own disappearance. Solid, immobile structures buried in the ground were to steadily give way to something as delicate and as ephemeral as the smoke coming out of the architect's ever-present cigar. Television signals would ultimately become the ideal medium, would take architecture's place and liberate a new kind of society. For Waxman, television was the promise of a super desirable post-architectural future. If architecture could be dissolved into electromagnetic waves of television, then it could actually offer hospitality to the citizens of the planet. It's weird, right? Because of course, this means that having this lecture on Zoom is in a certain sense, a kind of authentic way to think about what would be the architecture of television, because maybe Zoom is a kind of a television. Maybe you think that television has gone. Certainly the TV set sitting in the domestic house in a kind of place of honor, like a kind of fireplace around which the house warms itself, has been displaced by streaming images on portable surfaces of any size, on any wall, table, bed, elevator, taxi, airline seat, facade, cell phone, or watch. It seems like the very idea of television seems kind of quaint, a kind of historical relic, something that your parents would watch, let's say. And surely nothing could be less urgent to you than what your parents would do. So the old norm of a family or an individual, stationary, mesmerized, maybe even a whole nation, even the whole planet, all watching a TV set at the same time, receiving standardized content from specific channels at specific times, has given way to the fantasy that you can decide what you watch, where you watch it, how you watch it, and what is the place, time, speed, rhythm, interruptions, and repetitions of your choice. And likely you're doing many other things at the same time. I'm sure a number of you watching this lecture are preparing your meal, which is a good idea. I mean, meals are a good idea. Lectures, I don't know, you have to decide, right? So if you can watch a lecture while cooking, at least you survive. And Vaxman, in the end, is going to challenge what you think about survival. Don't we right now have the kind of fantasy that we are all permanently self-broadcasting, as if we all have our own dedicated channels for transmitting and receiving? It's obvious, right? All of us now transmit more than we receive. Consciously and consciously, we contribute vast amounts of data. Even our inactions, when you don't do something, that's going into the big data banks to be analyzed. And then all of this is fed back to us in screens in a kind of a mirror, but really a mirror that's presented in an image of you to maximize corporate profits, right? The real operation of these systems of artificial intelligence are designed to sort of slowly extract from you kind of microfinance for a big corporation. You get to say, I am myself. You get to do a selfie to confirm to the world that you are an individual. But of course, billions of people take identical selfies at the same time, somewhat desperately, as if actually we're radically uncertain about whether we still exist. At the very least, you have to say the 20th century idea of television has surely gone. Or is it the other way around? Is it that we are so deep in the world of television that we don't recognize it, right? It's not just that we have presidents who were reality TV stars, a frightening reality that we've all been through. Is it the case that television is just harder to see because it's so ubiquitous? Have we kind of, as it were, gone inside the TV? Isn't everyday life and even the global political economy a kind of vast system of interconnected, interacting and competing real-time programs presided over by these reality TV stars, or at least a kind of ecology in which you can't remove the concept of television? What if we ourselves, even our body and our brain, has become to some extent televisual? After all, there are already countless more cameras than bodies on the planet, right? And these cameras are, in a certain sense, part of our body. We all have now many ideas. There's kind of many eyes. There's been a kind of population explosion of cameras. And we can no longer distinguish our own eye from these electronic eyes. Our species has become irresistibly ever more televisual, right? So here we've got a choice, right? TV is either gone or it's everywhere. But either way you go, TV was always anti-architectural. Architects hate TV, right? They think it's insulting. TV just passes through a building as if it's not there, right? It doesn't stop and say hello, it just moves on through. It subverts conventional spatial logics. You can be at home watching a lecture at Penn State, which is actually being delivered from New York. Television collapses time and space, bringing the most distant event into the most intimate proximity and allowing vast numbers of people to occupy the same place at the same time. This is architecture, right? This is exactly what we, if architecture is a form of hospitality, which I think it is, this is a kind of hospitality. Equally, it allows us to occupy many different spaces at the same time or move between spaces as if traveling through a kind of a landscape or instantly jumping from space to space or stitching spaces together. In other words, television is not only architecture, but in a way, the viewer of television is a kind of an architect. And these no longer distant places that we watch on our screens, you could think of them as fictional or real, but it's more likely that you think of most of them as a kind of confusion of fictional and real, actually a kind of fusion that makes the space in which you are sitting itself seem somewhat fictional, or at least part of a kind of imaginary program. Isn't the whole thing about social media the idea that you could, as it were, look better and make a more interesting program, that you would adjust your props and your language and your angles and your filters and so on, so that you could actually perform? Or to say it another way around, all TV is reality TV, and we're all on reality TV. At the very least, television posed a huge threat to walls, and architects are identified with walls, lines that make a distinction between inside and outside. Or at least television transformed the ways that they were experienced or constructed a different kind of hole in the wall. Like if I watch a TV or I watch a screen, am I to some extent looking through the walls? So this anti-architecture of TV, this sort of insult to the architectural profession, actually became another kind of architecture. After all, you never simply watch TV, right? You inhabit it, right? Television is therefore an intimate part of the history of architecture, but it's a super embarrassing part of the history of architecture. So architects just prefer to act like it never really happened. So if TV came and went, architects are pretty happy about that, because television so profoundly infantilized buildings and therefore the architect. Just the word television produces a kind of tremor of professional embarrassment. I would say, and this is what I'm going to try to do in a few minutes with you, is to suggest that TV is so architectural that it has to be systematically overlooked by architects because it has so profoundly transformed human life, yet receives almost no attention from the discipline of architecture, which claims to be obsessed with taking care of human life. Okay, what am I talking about? Back to the joints, right? This is one of Waxman's earliest joints. Look how gorgeous it is, how beautiful it is, how a joint is like the joining of hands, right? That they overlap, how each element of the joint stitches itself, right? And it can be taken apart. It's a kind of lock. It's a kind of folding, kind of cleansing, clenching. Look at this metal clip. This is the clip that Waxman designed just after the war to produce the panel housing system. And you see that panels can be connected to this clip at any angle, such that you could make a house in a factory, put it on the back of a truck, empty it on the side, and build the house. And even the house would not be fixed in place, because if you can build it, you can unbuild it. So this is Walter Gropius's so-called expansible house. You see the middle section of the house has been assembled and then has an addition at the end and addition at the other end. This was a big concept. This was a government concept after the Second World War, that we needed some kind of expansive house that would change itself and change its format according to your needs, the size and shape of your family, whether your parents join you, the children leave to university, and so on. So in other words, architecture itself was there was the thought that it needed to become flexible. Architecture should be something kind of plastic or fluid. And so the expert of joints, Waxman, comes up with a system that the joint is so good that it allows wood panels to meet it at any angle. Some of those panels could be floors, some could be walls, some could be ceilings. It doesn't really matter. In the age of kind of, as it were, dematerializing architecture, if architecture is a kind of kit of parts, then it doesn't really belong anywhere. It can be put anywhere, and it has to be put anywhere in a kind of grid of points in space. So architecture assumes a kind of material form, and you can live in it, but it's here today and could be gone tomorrow. You could just decide you don't like that wall and move it. So there's a kind of aspiration to an architecture that is a kind of a kit set organized by a joint that allows architecture to become something fluid, something even kind of liquid, or at least plastic. Vaxman is not alone in this kind of dream. And this is a dream to produce architecture that would be like smoke. So this is Vaxman towards the end of his life in Los Angeles. And you can see his eyes sort of glaze looking into the distance. What he hopes to make is a kind of cloud. TV, by the way, was first demonstrated, the first electric television was demonstrated in San Francisco in 1927. And here you see it being demonstrated by its inventor, Farnsworth. Within a year, Ivan Leonidov in Moscow said, television is obviously the perfect medium for socialist architecture, because with television, we could all be united in one space, one socialist community at the size of the planet, right? In exactly the same year, Buckminster Fuller in Chicago put television at the center of his very first house and said that television is the ultimate architecture for radical democracy, because television allows you to be informed by everything that's going on and for you to participate in decision-making. So these two kind of models, one a kind of top-down state system by which everybody could benefit from the wisdom of those above to organize a global society which shares resources radically, communists. And though, as somebody that felt like with information, each of you can make your own decisions about where you want to go, capitalist, television somehow serves both fantasies. My point here is to note, architects started obsessing about television within 6 months of its invention. We didn't hesitate. Of course, both Leonidov and Fuller, who are super non-boring creatures, are always treated as a kind of a radical avant-garde. Both of them always had TV in every project that they did. Every project they did was a receiver of television signals and a broadcast of television signals. You see it again with Cedric Price. This is Fun Palace, more or less 1964. See the huge TV antenna. This is a university of the people. You don't go to a university to be told what to think by a professor. You go to a university and the architecture is just a piece of scaffolding that enables you to, following your desires, construct the kind of architecture that you want. And you must receive and broadcast all this information from this big TV aerial. Or more importantly, this is the Oxford Circus system of Cedric Price. It's a building in which the floors move up and down. Again, nothing in architecture will remain stable. You enter the space, which is a broadcast studio in which you construct yourself, you inform yourself. Again, same idea. There must be, designed by architects, communication circuits of television. The architect has to make sort of network diagrams. Cedric Price super interested in how could you broadcast TV images on the side of a building this big using this technology. Again, not alone. This is Hans Hollein's proposal for expanding the University of Vienna. Don't add a new building, just add a TV set, and you will exponentially enhance the capacity of the university to generate new knowledge. On and on. Ugo de Pietra, new forms of community, new forms of television. Television is like huge in the 60s. So let's say already in the 20s, there was this thought of TV. Then there is, of course, the kind of evolution of kind of canonic modern architecture, and always those figures like Leonidov, Fuller, and I could name others who are interested in kind of architecture made in electromagnetic space, they kind of like disappeared to the background. But then in the 60s, with all the experiments going on, TV comes back big time as the kind of replacement for buildings. So first you have buildings, you dissolve them in favor of TV. And here's a manifesto, as you see, written by Konrad Wachsmann for the evolution of assembling the artificial human environment between time and space, in which he precisely argues that architecture will give way, the idea of solid buildings will give the way to the idea of ephemeral points in space, not on the ground, but floating in the air. And you can use gleaming screens, electronic screens, to either create enclosure or exposure. So in a way, Vaxman is towards the end of his life writing this manifesto in Los Angeles, which is his final summary of a kind of lifelong mission to dissolve architecture. And what he argues in this manuscript, and you can see it even on the page, you see, he, the citizen, will be always intimately connected with his community and the world by electric waves, which transmit information to him, which he's free to accept or reject, as demonstrated in a television screen. So the leading expert in the industrialization of building, right? Somebody obsessed with the practicality of construction and the industrialization of construction, the great dream of the factory-made house that is everywhere in the discourse of modern architecture, ultimately is saying television is the kind of point to which we're aiming. And what the architect needs to do is to assemble networks of points in space that support like temporary configurations guided by computerized cybernetic feedback. Walls, floors, columns, doors, and windows are out. They're replaced with a new technology, which, as he said, there is no word for this yet. Any illusion that buildings are permanent has to give way to what he calls the perpetual adaptability of a seemingly massless structure, like a porous, perforated structure that is just reinforced temporarily by certain screens that you subin, sort of TV screens. So he's producing a hardcore image of a hyper-dissolved architecture, a kind of architecture after architecture, a kind of barely visible mirage, an ever-shifting but precisely defined space of energy and information flow. But Vaxman doesn't think this is a dream. This is not like a kind of Silicon Valley fantasy. He thinks it's a form of realism. It's a portrait of the inevitable. And of course, you recognize that it sounds exactly like Silicon promises about the new kind of democracy made available by electronic communication. He's arguing that's inevitable. It's a kind of portrait of the inevitable. It's a kind of documentary. I think that Vaxman thought of himself as a kind of documentary artist, producing a kind of documentary to counter the unbelievably stubborn default settings of architectural discourse. This vision of the near future of Vaxman is, of course, catching up to us. This is one of the reasons. And it's catching up to us because, of course, it tunes into or echoes the vast megastructure spiderwebs proposed by a globally dispersed community of experimental design. All the experimental architects, almost all of the 60s and 70s, fantasized some kind of world of the future with TV. Look at this drawing of Zenithos, electronic urbanism, 1969, where the structures of architecture get replaced with the sort of transmission wires. You hang out in a kind of bubble. Look, this is what replaces cities, a continuous communication net in which you hang in this bubble, watching TV, where you do your work, your labor, your pleasure, and your control. Notice actually there's no human here. Actually, the chair has assumed a kind of human-like position. It seems to be the chair that's looking at TV. This is a little bit matrix-like in its quality. Anyway, if a human was to be there, is this human trapped in there thinking that she's the pilot of the universe? Or is it a cell of confinement in which you no longer can understand the extent to which your own body has been extracted? But there it is. The future of architecture is watching television. How does it connect to Vaxman? Vaxman is able to escape Europe after the Second World War, in which his sister and mother were murdered in the camps only able to escape the Holocaust through the interventions of Walter Gropius, you see on the right, and Albert Einstein, who made a special plea for him to be able to get out of the country. He then spent about a year living in the basement of the famous Ilse and Walter Gropius house, and in that space designed this system of industrialized architecture that we saw before. What's important is that this system, which is the system for a kind of factory-produced house that could be placed anywhere in the world at any time, treats information as a building material in its own right. For Waxman, you never suspend information in a space. Information is the producer of a space or the engineer of a space. Conventional buildings are dissolved by, as it were, energy waves. So there you see them making the house. You can see that Waxman is explaining to Gropius how the house works, because Gropius had no idea. Gropius is just the sort of name that legitimates this project, which is a super Waxman project. And the people who really know what they're doing are the ones that are actually working. So there is Waxman in the suit giving a kind of an authoritative description to Walter Gropius. And you could well ask yourself, what the hell are they doing up there? Of course, they're up there to be photographed as if they are in the control of the production of this object. And these are the drawings of that object, right? The ways in which you would connect it together. And this is Waxman's drawing of how you would build such an architecture, because if any panel can meet the joint at any angle, how does a builder start? Well, it starts with one joint and one panel, and then just has to turn to the right or the left, up or down. So actually, the project is assembled, let's say, in kind of conceptual space, or at least in the air, as you see from this sort of image. And this is the first time it was exhibited when Konrad Wachsmann went to teach at the Institute of Design in Chicago. And there is where Waxman makes this astounding project, which is his first real attempt to produce a cloud. And this is the result of that joint that I showed you before, a kind of thin sort of see-through structure that's there. This is the structure, by the way, in which the concept of Spaceframe is made famous. This is the hangar for these bombers you see in the distance. These bombers are designed, the largest bombers ever made. Their mission it is to drop bombs anywhere in the world. So this is really death in technological form. And you see what happened to the humans. They sit underneath this structure. In a certain way, the horror of that bomber is less than the shock of this structure. Either the structure is some sort of alien spacecraft. Look at how it touches the ground, like it's ready to fly off. Or it's the symptom of what the human has already become, the strange technological creature we had become. Certainly the old human is something tiny, image after image, that you see this person on the right-hand side of this image just wondering, what the hell is this, right? If this is architecture, it's not what we've seen before. It's a kind of fabric suspended in space. And it might be the future us or the future of architecture. The only place the human is allowed to go in is the space for the computers you see hanging there below. Vast, photographed, a huge floating horizontal, right? Detailed very precisely. It's designed for the US Air Force. They're going to make it. This is not a fantasy of the future. This is architecture in the age and serving the military, right? It's a weapon, if you like. It's a weapon that no longer offers simply shelter to the human, but offers, in a certain way, a glimpse of the disappearance of the human, right? The model is, of course, for Waxman, Paxton's Crystal Palace, an industrialized building of metal and glass that was the first building that the interior was so big and the glass disappeared when you looked up, that for the first time, everybody wrote about the fact that when you're inside this building, the inside is bigger than the outside and the building itself disappears. This is the thing. Waxman is interested in disappearing. Here we're looking more closely at the model. It's made in plastic, so perfectly made in the plastic that the model is used for the final structural calculation. Here's Waxman inside the real thing, like the one-to-one prototype. Not good enough. What's better is the plastic. The plastic is made by students. This is a student project taught in the Institute of Design in exactly the same space that a year before, 1949, Buckminster Fuller had made his first dome. Right? Again, the dome being replacing a building with a three-dimensional window, a window that offers you a minimum shelter and a maximum of information context. So there are the students making this thing. And Vaxman and the students have no idea what they've done. Look at them, kind of disturbed, shocked. They take the same position, the same horror or amazement as, look at him. It's as if he could try to sort of smoke his way into understanding this. It's almost as if the student is calling the hospital to take care of Vaxman, who's just stood here looking at this thing for 6 hours, amazed, confused even, right? Students might pretend to play with the model, but the look on the student's face, one of the three students that was involved in the final phase of the project, is, I would say, a little bit shocked. This is the model being prepared to be photographed so that it could be published in 1954 in every major architectural magazine in the world, exactly after the Air Force said, we're not going to build it. So this arrives, this project, in every magazine, exactly in the moment in which it's finished, but it exists as this almost hypnotic image of what architecture would be if architecture became a kind of a networked structure. It had a predecessor. It was based on an earlier structure that Waxman worked on when he first arrived in the United States after the war. And you see, again, a kind of floating horizontal on minimal legs. Once again, it's an amazing joint, which makes a space in which the walls can move and disappear, and the roof can move and disappear. And the whole thing looks like it could walk away. And again, they're looking at, it comes down to the ground like the legs of some kind of instrument or the landing gear of some kind of aircraft. And indeed, it's again made for aircraft and theoretically could be as big as you want. It was exhibited at the Museum of Modern Art. You see it kind of hanging there, look, no hands, floating, a perfect floating horizontal, trying to be as little defining as possible. Architecture will no longer come up out of the ground and dictate where you are and produce hierarchies. It's horizontal in a kind of post-hierarchical environment. Again, the lonely person, unsure what this thing is. It's all moving, all the parts. Maybe you recognize that this sort of idea, this idea was at the heart of all those radical projects of the 60s and 70s, an architecture that could be so flexible, that's totally realistic, but produces a kind of a dream space or a space of desire. Here's Waxman photographed in Popular Science, again, as if he hasn't quite figured out what this thing is, even after it's being exhibited at MoMA. This is not the heroic figure of the self-confident. This is the uncertain figure, the questioning figure. This is his favorite image of the project, a pure white floating structure, as little there as possible. And maybe when you're looking at this, you say, oh yeah, but that's just sort of Miesian horizontality and so on. Okay, good point. Mies and Vaxman were drinking buddies at Chicago. And when I mean drinking buddies, professional drinkers, serious drinkers, right? And were seriously in agreement about the thought of a kind of a horizontal architecture. Here's Mies in his apartment. In this apartment, he received the students working on the project and gave them feedback. Students report what a privilege it was to arrive at the apartment of Mies van der Rohe and be given, personally made by Mies van der Rohe, the strongest gin martinis that they had ever drunk in their life, while Mies made commentary on their projects in a seminar being taught by Mies, who was at IIT, and Vaxman, who was at the Institute of Design. By the way, Mies had a huge TV, loved Westerns and boxing. Nobody talks about that because it's inconsistent with our dream of that. Vaxman had a baby TV, but watched it all the time and talked about it all the time. What they had in common, Vaxman is actually so close. He's the one that presents an honorary degree, an honorary PhD to Mies. Vaxman is very, very present in Farnsworth House and is involved in the discussions about Farnsworth House and the kind of details of how this house will work. Again, maybe the quintessential floating horizontal house. There is an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art, and the last project is this one. And this is the one that Vaxman publishes when he does a special issue on Mies for Arts and Architecture. Again, not a very popular project in architecture because it's a fast food restaurant, and somehow it's as if Mies is thought to be contaminated by fast food. But you can see why Vaxman is obsessed. The dimension of the structure above is the same as the distance below. It's not so clear if you occupy the structure or you occupy below. It's again a floating horizontal, a minimal set of trusses that enable a kind of maximum set of exchange. Basically, this is a hospitality for you to meet cooking machines, right? The sort of fast food machinery. Vaxman, who is this guy? Who is this person that escapes the horror of the war and ends up so close to Mies, that sometimes when you're looking at Mies, you don't realize you're really looking at Waxman. Here he is as a cabinet maker, and he was, as a young cabinet maker, an expert in making coffins, because the First World War was good business for coffins. And Waxman describes that he would make a perfect coffin, he would sleep in it at lunchtime, and then he would polish it and paint it, and then take it to the hospital. And he would do that every day with a sense of accomplishment and contribution, until his brother died in the war, and he was horrified to see that his mother was treated as some kind of heroine, and his brother, who had been murdered by technology, the First World War, technological war, murdered essentially for nothing, treated also as a hero. So Waxman suddenly is very, very shocked about the inhumanity of the human, and I think carries this wound so strong, and the sadness of this. But this is an expert in how you put things together, who begins by putting together the boxes, the last architecture. And he says, this is I made the last house for all of these people that died, who at some point is going to end up making a house for bombers, having himself escaped the horror of the murder. By the way, he goes to Paris and he's working for Le Corbusier, who doesn't pay. And as a result of not being paid by Le Corbusier, he doesn't eat. So he's walking the streets of Paris selling a communist newspaper. His sister understands that maybe he would even die. And his teacher, the super interesting expressionist Hans Polsek, sends him a ticket. And when he arrives in Berlin, Polsek says, I found you a job in this place. And this place is the largest prefabricated wooden architecture factory in the world. And within 6 months, Waxman becomes the major figure. They had started with hospital buildings, as you see, very temporary mobile systems. And they produced also houses. This, for example, is a Polsek house, and systems that could be easily done. And all of this will end up something like this in this kind of project. So we have to go somehow from this idea of the industrialized building that Waxman learns about in the forests in Germany, and he's making thousands of buildings all over the world, to this hangar that will never be built. And this is the first image of the project where you see the bombers kind of lurking there. This is the model that's being photographed there. These are the students making the model, testing the model. But there were many potentials, including just a radical horizontal. Again, you would say super Miesian, no accident, because he's teaching with Mies. This is one of the student projects. Again, a super floating horizontal. Again, another student project of Mies and Waxman. And then eventually Waxman will stop working on this, and the system, by the way these tubes are attached to each other is the system of the hangar. In other words, not only could architecture form itself into a hangar, but it could form itself into a convention center. Mies continues to work with his students and produces this, one of the most famous projects of Mies, which of course is a student project produced very much under his guidance. And it's the dream again of the flying horizontal, which becomes the famous convention project of Mies. But probably you know that Mies's horizontals are never quite like Waxman. Mies's horizontals often had kind of granite. The great trick of Mies is it looks like a big piece, a big solid thing is floating in the air for no good reason. And you know it's never going to move. So it's weird that it's flying, and it's even weirder that it's never going to fly away. Like if it managed to get up in the air like that, why doesn't it just disappear? Whereas Waxman's are light and cloud-like, and they give off the impression they're going to fly away at any moment. And so he draws this cloud, and he draws it with such precision. How do you make a cloud, right? It's a high precision activity. Look at how beautifully it's drawn to try to persuade the military. You produce an image like this, put it on the wall, and one last attempt to persuade the military to build your project. And then they're actually saying, no, we're not going to do it. And Waxman always, in a way, comparing this cloud-like effect to this kind of woven textile quality. He's fired from the Institute of Design because the military are no longer paying for him. And he starts a kind of nomadic teaching project in which again and again, with these little workshops he does with students, they always produce the same thing, floating horizontals. This is a tuberculosis hospital. This is a school in Japan. This is in Austria, like a look no hands flying horizontal. Unbelievable project. This is amazing. It's just 2 trusses, you see them there, and a system of electric panels that can be rearranged in any pattern to produce roofs or walls and so on. A completely flexible, again, architecture can be what it is you want it to be, and Vaxman like a kind of child working on that project. Imagine that you magnified the potential of architecture, and the thing that magnifies architecture so much is just this very, very thin, a pair of these very thin trusses. And this system, very, very beautiful. Waxman had, from the moment he arrived in the United States, insisted to Gropius and everybody else that architecture is a form of electricity. Here is Waxman, along with Neutra and Gropius, Serd, Alto, Gideon, Chomayev, Hadnat, Labatou, all of the mafia, almost all the mafia of modern architecture, assemble in a conference at Princeton called Building Modern Man, like making him new human, right? Making man modern. And Waxman gets up and says, everything is electricity. Architecture aspires to being pure electricity. So it's kind of ideas that you would associate much more with the 60s and 70s than with this particular moment just after the war. Just to give you a sense, this is Waxman at Ulm, where he's teaching with Max Bill. He's kind of in a propaganda tour paid for by the US government as part of the policy to say that design and good design is going to solve all the problems of the world. And everywhere he went, he attracted the best students. So, for example, here he is in Tokyo, and all of the members of what will become the metabolists are in that room. When he's in Austria, you see him working with the model, again, designing with his cigar. Then when he's in Haifa, for example, here he is teaching. Yonah Friedman is there, and Yonah Friedman says he remembers seeing this, and he was inspired by this to produce his kind of a spatial city. All of the radical avant-garde from England, from Italy, from France, from Germany, Austria, the United States, Japan, all identify themselves as students of Waxman. In other words, they could smell that Waxman was dematerializing architecture and liberating a new kind of political project. All of them, in a way, got forgotten very quickly in the 1970s. The discipline tried to sort of act like none of that ever happened, that this was just a badly behaved moment of architecture, and architecture was really about structure and order, and there was discipline. And Waxman also disappeared, was sort of forgotten. Now that we are so tuned in to how important those experiments of the 60s and 70s are and how they resonate with the issues of our own day, Waxman, maybe we need to look at Waxman again, a teacher's teacher, always teaching, right? Producing this kind of project. This is the building I showed you before that's just two trusses. Look at the structural grid. It's also a set of sockets, and those sockets are electrical and structural. So there's no distinction between electricity and information. And again, maybe you can figure it out, which of these is the electrical diagram and which is the structural diagram. So if there are these floating horizontals, they are charged with electricity and information. But the single image that most dominated Waxman was this one. He produced it with students in 1950, and he simply didn't know what he had done. He ended almost every lecture with this image. And he said, I did this with the students in Chicago to show what you can do when you don't know what you're doing. And he was mesmerized by this. So much was he confused by this that he pretended that he did it in 1953 rather than in 1950. I think because it's so much more radical than the Hangar project from 1950 to 54. So he wanted to present this as the sort of ultimate image. Notice that here you see the holes in the joint, the emptiness, but you see there's not a joint and the thing that's been joined. The joint and the thing are the same thing. It's actually one twisted circuitry, right? An absolutely amazing structure. He pretended that he didn't have the money or students to work on this. In fact, he had all the money from the military and all the money and plenty of students. And students worked on this. I think he held this thing as a kind of lure or almost a kind of religious Mandela, a kind of image of what architecture could be, an image of the future. He was very fond of zooming in on it like this and sending images like this to Walter Gropius and John Intenza, asking them to guess what it is that they were looking at. Because to inhabit the structure would also to be not quite sure where you are. He made a huge print of it. You see it here on the wall as he's sitting with Bernard Rudovsky in Chicago, again as a kind of Mandela. It was on the wall when the military were arguing about his project, just as the earlier horizontal had been on his wall in Chicago when he had a studio with Chomayev. And on the wall, it's always used as a background to his head we always see Waxman in this kind of, look at him, he's not so sure. Right? Always this kind of, this is what I've done, but what is it that I have done? This is part of my brain, or I'm part of that brain. I present myself, right? As if this thing is coming out of his head. Now we're back in Germany, East Germany, actually, later in his life. Look at the system that makes the hangar. The system dreams of this kind of logic. Here's the presentation to the military. Look how he's even industrialized the drawing, because all the details of the joint, since the joints are always the same, has been industrialized into a kind of a pattern. So the back of the drawing has this on it, right? And then it starts to get published, and it's an amazing image. I never saw an architect who was not intoxicated by this image, but to be intoxicated with this image is a bit like a fly to the spider's web. And it's a web, right? It's a spider's web. He called it a spider's web. Be careful. If you like this image and you head into it, you're never going to come out, or you're never going to come out as an architect. And by the way, it is a kind of portal, right? So for me, Vaxman thought of this image as the sort of threshold to whatever comes after architecture. It's the last thing you will see of architecture before it disappears, right? It's all in the context, again, of Gropius and always alcohol. And it starts to get published. It starts to become the image. At first, Waxman didn't publish it. He was uncertain about it, but it starts to appear. It appears a lot later than the hangar. He shows us the sketches of how it began, and he starts to exhibit it. He puts it at the center of all of his exhibitions. It goes onto the cover of magazines. Color images arrive, right? The web, the web, the web. Always, when he wants to say, what are the main things about architecture? There it is. Again, operating as a Mandela. It's in the window of his most important exhibitions. It becomes the title of the exhibition, right? Even when he is so flattered to be exhibited alongside Le Corbusier, there it is, there it is. And the name, his name is inside that drawing. And there it is at USC in his final big exhibition, a traveling exhibition. And his famous book, Wendenbuch im Bauen, which he designed thoroughly, has at the center of it a kind of Playboy centerfold of this thing that he don't know what it is. And I'm sure this is the book launch, and I'm sure he's telling the publisher, this is the most amazing thing I've done, and I don't know what I've done. And you see the publisher a little bit confused about what's going on. And notice that even he signed this thing. This is the only document he ever signs, because he's convinced this is how he produces it, huge ink drawings, which are then reversed. He never works on this. But what I want to say very quickly is the drawing kind of moves into his model for teaching. This is how you teach. You have 7 groups of students, 3 each. They sit at 7 different tables and work on for 3 days on one dimension of the problem. At the end of the 3 days, they report to everybody else what they have learned. Then you all switch to another group. So at the end of the 21 days, all of you in the studio have worked on every dimension of the problem and shared everything you know. And somewhere in the middle, you figured out what you're working on. So it's a studio in which they don't know what they're going to make, right? A kind of research studio. And you look at the twisting. This is the kind of twisting web, which is a pedagogical instrument. So this thing, which is all about information, has become a way of teaching. This is the circuit diagram as published in Japan. Here it is in Salzburg. Here it is like cleaned up for a Swiss magazine. And notice at the bottom, he's even very clear where everybody needs to sit, the folders of their information, and the final table around which you will gather in your groups of 3 with him listening. And by the way, he's not supposed to teach you. He's just supposed to facilitate you exchanging information, right? This is the table in Japan. And every time he goes somewhere, he has to make a very precise layout. So in other words, everybody has to finally sit around this table and make a kind of network conversation of everything they've learned. And it's really like this. Waxman is all about tables, right? Producing this work. And when he goes, finally, for the first time in his life, he gets a full-time job at USC. Of course, he invites Mies van der Rohe to come and help him open this thing. And there they are making the opening. And of course, he has to redo his diagram, because now his diagram is the sort of circuit diagram of an entire school or a division of the school, building technology research. And so students are inside this web, this twisted web. And look at the bottom, there's still this table, a kind of multimedia table in which everything will happen. And then he thinks, hey, if there is this network which produces architecture, what is the network of the university in which the architecture school appears? And he does this idea that the future of the university is a set of points in space. This is architecture in yellow, kind of down towards the end between childhood and professional life on the right. But it's a network, and every point in the network can explode, So you're inside a huge kind of explosion of knowledge. So he basically starts to say that there's an architecture of the university, or an ideal architecture of collaboration and cooperation. And he insists that no idea ever comes from one person, but from what he calls a team, right? And what do they produce? Again, the same old thing, floating horizontals. But the most amazing horizontal project is the Civic Center, the final project he did with students, which is the most Miesian of Miesian, much more Miesian than Mies, floating horizontal, in which it's not really a building, but just a kind of carpet floating in space that's completely open because it's the Civic Center. So you can watch all the operations of the politicians producing this kind of effect. It's really a bridge, right? These cables are under unbelievable tension, but there has to be a television antenna so that everything that goes on in the Civic Center is watched in real time by citizens and they could contribute. So it's a kind of image of radical democracy in which the architect's normal site plans are replaced by kind of, let's say, electromagnetic waves. This is just demonstrating how the broadcasts from the building will work. So this is, literally architecture built in electromagnetic space, right? This is the client being shown the project. It's meant to happen. Once again, Waxman is making an extraordinary radical project, architecturally, informationally, and politically for the desert that doesn't happen, but it makes it to the cover of Arts and Architecture. And look at it. Again, the most radical statement of the floating horizontal yet, right? But it's really about the TV antenna, which is then exhibited in real time, once again, and explained to Fuller. And, Fuller didn't like to listen to other people. He used to turn his hearing aid off. You see the hearing aid, didn't like to hear others, even Waxman. So you get the sense that they're both talking through and past each other. So just to finish, this is Waxman as a young architect. You see him all the way over on the left there, standing on his first house done in Berlin. And he builds hundreds of houses in Berlin and Germany and around the world. And eventually, the beginnings maybe even of the Spaceframe. And finally, he becomes like Mr. Construction. But the reality is, Mr. Construction in the United States never built anything. So he's the most famous, most material, most precise engineer of industrialized building. He's our very image of this expertise, and it's a very physical image. But in fact, he didn't build anything. And at a certain point, he started to realize that this table around which you share information, you see the model in the background of this TV studio, in which people like Rainer Banham would come to visit, or the great engineer Loricole, he started to realize the future of the university is television, and therefore the future of Waxman would be to have a TV program. He was on a TV program, as you see here in 1970, where he was part of a group of experts who discussed the possible future of privacy. And these are his own photographs while sitting there. So he decided he had to make a TV program. He went to TV companies and they said, great idea, but to make a TV program, you need to make a book. And this is him imagining how that program would work. It would be part of a network, a media network in which the people would be provided access. He solicited Kenneth Frampton to be the historian, Max Bill to be the educator, Kami to be the visual arts, and so on. He really went to all of his friends to produce this amazing thing. When he was saying how this project would work, he described something like what you would think of today as the cell phone, like a little thing you hold in your hand with a screen, which you can get any kind of information. It's one of the earliest and clearest descriptions of the technology that we now use. It's a kind of image of how information might work. His own metaphor when presenting that technology were these nets in Greece that he photographed, because he was also a photographer and publisher of photographs that are there but not there, right? Kind of ephemeral and gauzy. So here he is assembling the photographs for this book. This is the figure, right? In Chicago, in an exhibition alongside Buckminster Fuller, once again explaining that architecture is electricity, that architecture is information, that the future of architecture is television. No one I have ever heard referred to Waxman talking about television. I don't know of any text of Waxman that doesn't talk about TV. In other words, he's one of the most published, most famous, most inspirational figures of the 20th century who's always talking about television, and architects don't want to hear, right? Producing this stuff. And his final kind of manuscript, which is the manuscript for the book, that would be the book of the TV series, he chooses this image and this one, which of course is the hole at the center of that radical twisted net, the hole around which a kind of ephemeral architecture would gather. That is to say, architecture would be built around a whole. It became kind of like the branding of Waxman himself. Whenever he gave a lecture, it was the same image. And this gets us back finally to Albert Einstein. Waxman says that he already thought architecture was going to be displaced by electricity when he was doing the summer house for Einstein. And he thought everything about architecture would change. Einstein didn't agree with that at all and said architecture will stay much the way it is. I think that Waxman didn't know what an architecture of electricity and information would be, but his whole life was, in a way, trying to say to Einstein, who he deeply admired, I can get it. Waxman always wrote about the future. He said the future is precisely not predictable, but you've got to try. You've got to always try and always fail. And his failed effort was to try to imagine a kind of architecture of the cloud, right? An architecture of information, a kind of gauzy, almost invisible, sort of dematerialized architecture. In my opinion, it's a shocking, consistent philosophical and political thesis. We could criticize it. We could say, hey, these sort of fantasies of ubiquitous information turn out to be very effective engines of inequity, as we have seen recently. But first, we should probably listen to Waxman or look at Waxman. And that little book I did is just a sort of trick to force people to have a look at Waxman and also to come up with ideas, right? And I wrote the book in order that maybe you could, look at this work and wonder what it means and wonder how it might connect to the urgencies of today, where we find ourselves, as we are tonight, always in the ephemeral architecture of the televisual media, which is simultaneously a kind of a liberation, but also simultaneously maybe something we don't admire or need to resist. If Waxman was an anti-architect, perhaps you, as the next generation, will be the kind of anti-architects that need to undo Waxman. It doesn't, I would say, it doesn't really matter what he thinks, or even if he was an interesting person or not. I just feel at some level a little bit proud that there are these people in our tradition, in our history, that have made such radical attempts to sort of undo the arrogance, the pretension, the hierarchical dominating privilege that is the field architecture, and suggest that rather than stabilize and produce sort of artificial images of stability, architecture should, as it were, get out of the way so that people can really live together more closely and more in more kind of complex. So this book, of course, is a little bit of a love story. It's obvious that I'm a fan. I'm not saying you have to be a fan too, but I think it's not so bad to know that our field is not as boring as it so often looks. Anyway, it was super nice to be with you, and I'm really looking forward to your questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. Perhaps we can start the conversation and then, ask you some questions, and I'm going to maybe, initiate that by asking you about the anthropological side of all this. I mean, which is, the point that you finished. I mean, and going back to that conference at Princeton, Building the Modern Man, and looking backwards now, we see that actually the modern person was way more than just, a form of construction. It was, the construction of a different subject. And I wondered, and I wondered to what extent, that modern subject kind of, or the fantasies of Waxman have been materialized or have been successful, nowadays in this context of ubiquitous media, screens, right, networks, etc.
Yeah, I mean, of course, the project that Beatrice and I did in Istanbul on the question, are we human? You're right, it's directly relevant to this. And in that project, it was really a question, right? Literally a question, like, are we human? And anyway, what's the we? Is the we bags of bacteria like we are? Is the we insects, protocols, technologies, and so on? It's a big question about the we. And you're right that architects don't design for humans, they design humans. So we're kind of in the human engineering business. And that doesn't sound like a very modest thing or necessarily such a good thing, especially if the human that's being designed looks so familiar in the sense of a kind of white, largely male sort of subject, right? That the ideal occupant of this future world is exactly the same figure that seems to have occupied the history of our field, which presupposes, of course, kind of an excluded and demoted, a kind of outed and downed citizenry that's actually maintaining those very same systems, right? Or are being literally, their brains are being exploited for that. So I think there is this question of, there's a human engineering thing going on, which in Waxman's mind is liberation and political liberation. It's an explicitly political project, but that politics needs to be rethought by us. And there may be some of the things that he's doing that we could stay with. But I would say today we're kind of on our guard. And it's interesting, if television was never really talked about, I love McLuhan, who also needs to be criticized and so on, but his simple idea that you never see technology until it's redundant. So maybe now we see television and we can talk about television because it's disappeared. His famous comment that the content of every new media is old media. Your own new media is so radical in the way it changes your body and brain that it's too disturbing to see it. So you anesthetize yourself. So what if architects anesthetize themselves against television? And now it emerges as a kind of artifact that they can think about. And what kind of projects could come from that? And what kind of other architects have we forgotten? And other architects could mean other people, but it could also mean other groups or other technologies or other anti-technologies and so on. So I think we are in a very important moment where there's a great urgency to rethink the human, because firstly, the human doesn't seem that human, or it seems at least inhuman in its very nature. We seem to be kind of a horrific species. And secondly, we were never what we thought we were. We are always bags of liquid and flows of energy. I make myself by breathing, right? I bring the outside world into my body to make my body, and then I expel some of what I take from the outside, and I make the line between outside and inside out of the outside. So if architecture is about making the line between inside and outside, those lines are always folds, right? They're always, we sort of swallow, we eat the kind of outside to make this thing the inside. So even if we really want to be doing, as you said, this anthropocentric thing, really thinking about the human in the more classical sense, that human figure is totally weird. I don't know about you, but my body is I don't want to know. It's so weird. Like, where's the inside of my body? Does the outside pass right through me from one hole to another? And the real line between inside and outside are the porous membranes with which I receive certain chemicals and which I expel other chemicals? Is that really the line? In which case, if architecture is based on the body, as we've been talking about since Greeks, that body is weird. And if we are making a distinction between inside and outside, couldn't we take account of the fact that buildings are weird? That buildings are also full of weird pipes and connections and wires and smells and totally weird. It starts to make architecture seem actually kind of interesting. But yeah, let me summarize where you're going, because I think it's such an important point. There's no doubt it's explicit, particularly in canonic descriptions of modern architecture, that the purpose of architecture is to rebuild the human subject that has been devastated by warfare. But let's say postmodern architecture, or at least that moment of the 70s that tried to reconsolidate architecture and produce a more conventional kind of pre-technological subject, that was also human engineering and presented as such. And most of what we hear in architecture schools by our most interesting students, it's all about changing the human. And why not? We're weird, so why not? Change. Why not?
Absolutely.
Kind of a speech instead of an answer, right?
Yeah. No, it's fine. I mean, there's a side which it's very much political, out of
Yeah.
this. Of course, one is the relationship of the individual with the environment, and this distinction. I mean, again, I'm not going to reiterate what you just said, who are we, who are, and who's the we, but then there's also this kind of more social side. There's a real state in media. Actually, there are the economies of media. There are all the political issues that come, with the redefinition of the subject in this kind of new environment that actually ends up constructing a different kind of groupings, we call multitudes, that sometimes, and that's probably knowing that actually he was coming from the left side of the political spectrum, to what extent, that cloud had some kind of a utopian sense in which, in that sense, makes him radically modern, to what extent, this cloud was for the betterment of society, whereas actually what we are is at this kind of or facing this new technology. We do not really master that technology, nor the real estate, nor the economies, who's the product, who's the, what are we transmitting, is it we, all those kinds of aspects, and how, in its infancy, it's all this project, actually.
I again, super interesting. I think that, for me personally, none of you need me to say that this is a good moment, because it's also a very shitty moment, right? Everything feels very, very fragile and worrying. Fascism on the rise, and our attempts to undo it not very successful, but I think also super exciting because, for example, the extent to which architecture as a field has been forced to think about its own participation and racialization, and think about its own kind of anthropocentrism, and think of its own kind of dedication to binaries, so that something really, I think some sort of exciting work will follow. I'm super opposed to sort of white guilt or sort of heterosexual guilt. I think, for example, discourse, sort of trans discourse, is extraordinarily important and urgent and beautiful, and enables us to see differently. Likewise, the discourse about racialization, likewise, the anthropocentrism. Once you understand that you're a bag of bacteria that have been around for millions of years and you're just a kind of vehicle, it's time to get a little bit modest, right? The cockroaches, we're committing suicide, right? So we're out in a couple of generations. The cockroaches never even will have noticed, right? So all of this crisis, it's just a crisis of this figure of the human. So I think there is a very important mode of reflection in architecture now, which is to try to say, okay, what are the other kinds of engagement possible? And to what extent do these criticisms, sort of self-criticisms, open up for us really important political potentials, and in which way that we've always sort of known that architecture is implicitly political. In which way could that be less, more than that, just a kind of fortune cookie, phrase, right? So I think in your spirit, it's not so much let's sit down and redesign the human. Let's understand the human was never what we thought it was, and design was never what we thought it was. And actually, we're in a much more delirious and complex scene of an extraordinary complexity of agencies, in which architecture has a role, maybe a kind of anesthetic role or a kind of role of denial. And what if we just said, okay, time out. Let's try not the denial, but let's do the opposite. Like, let's go to the shrink. Let's have a session, like a year, 2 years, which architecture blurts out all of its stuff. I think amazing stuff would come out, and that could be the beginnings of new forms of responsibility for our field. And I'm always, as a teacher, just thrilled because you can feel that going on in this generation of students. I know it's a nightmare to be told you're part of a generation and all that, but still, you've got 1 million architecture students in the world that are pretty much connected to each other, that are bored with the old stuff, which doesn't give them anything anyway. In fact, tells them that they can't be an architect until they're 90 years old. By the way, check it out. Think of your favorite building and then look at the age of the architect when they did it. Very likely that she's in her early 30s. So it's nonsense. Don't believe it for a minute. Architects do amazing stuff early. It's actually more hard to do amazing stuff when you're old. Maybe the reason that our field is dominated by 90-year-old white men is because actually they're not able to do very much. And that's what society wants architects to not do very much. Anyway, another speech. I'm like
Mark?
a speech a minute, push the button and another speech comes out.
Mark, can I jump in here with some questions?
Yeah, please.
From the audience?
Yeah, Marcus, let's do it.
Okay. First one, there were a number of women in the photographs you showed, but you did not mention their names. Do you have any sense of who they were?
Yes. So most importantly was Daisy Eigel. Daisy Eigel was a Brazilian architect who went to the Institute of Design, and she's one of the 3 people that worked with Waxman on this astonishing drawing, right? And she continued to work on the hangar. So much of the atmosphere of Waxman, the teaching environment, is a boys' club and not diverse in the interesting sense. But there are certain key women. Another one is Anne Ting. Anne Ting, after graduating, worked for Waxman. I think, I was fortunate enough to spend some time with her, usually on juries, where I just was so much in awe. I could hardly say a word because I just couldn't believe there she was. And she's just a beautiful, thoughtful, intelligent person. Of course, that she's the only person that Buckminster Fuller considered to be an equal in thinking geometry, right? And I don't know to what extent she's influencing the sort of geometric logic of Waxman. But I have to say, when Waxman said nobody does anything alone, he really acted that out. So there's no doubt that she was the equal of Waxman when he had this little office in New York and they were trying to make this hangar. So of course it goes both ways. We can see when he was in the 30s in this factory, he really came up with this astonishing idea about systems and information, I think, and how this was a kind of geometry. I think this is maybe contributing to her brilliance, but I'm pretty sure she made him less boring, right? So there are, I would say, in a general boys' club environment, as always, certain figures who would be identified as women, whose work, in a way, so radicalized what was going on that they tend to be repressed. Old story, right? The nightmare of the present, which is the past, right? But there she is. I mean, for those of you who don't know her or her work, check it out. Check out the person who designed Louis Kahn, right? Imagine he's a kind of project. Sorry, Elizabeth. Yeah.
No problem. I was curious as to your thoughts of with Wachsman's desire for collaboration, right?
Yeah.
At that time, obviously he was missing key factors of networking that we have today. We have the internet, for example. Do you think that his future work or his future self would have embraced the open source community, these kind of ad hoc, community build projects, specifically the architectural ones, in his development process?
Yeah, who knows, right? But I think I want to say yes. I mean, because he's almost saying it, right? He's almost saying, of course, what you say is more interesting because the implication of what you're saying is that sort of multiple strategic groups with different agendas are putting themselves into kind of networks in order to do certain things. And maybe he has a more classical understanding of politics that if everybody contributed information and received all information, politicians would be irrelevant. This is exactly the same position of Buckminster Fuller. So it doesn't allow for micro networks or private networks or even the kind of logic of passwords and all of that. But let's say conceptually, I think if it was proposed to him, like if you were the hypothetical student, he would be, you would just discover that what you just said was actually the name of the studio project. It was producing these local, active, carnivorous, nomadic, transitional nets, which were very local and yet took advantage of global kind of resources and global intelligence. He would go there. It's very close to that. When you look at his drawings of these vast information networks, though, you might, like me, feel a bit like, okay, it's a bit like a regime, right? Because everywhere is always the same joint and the same flower. Yes, it's a flower and flowers are beautiful, but I don't know. Life surrounded only by flowers, especially if you are allergic to pollen, not a great idea. Or how beautiful is a flower if you're in a million of them, right? I don't know. So there is some level at which maybe there's a kind of naivety. I think, because I am a bit of a fan, I think if accused of this, he would accept the criticism. And just to end where you began, he so deeply believed in this model of collaboration. I mean, it really is sort of like, I would say, even more hardcore than contemporary fantasies about interconnectivity. He's just simply believed that intelligence never was located in a brain, or at least it was always a collective brain. And I think, just my thing, right? But I think we became insects, we humans, right, became insects at the end of the 19th century once we sprouted our own radio antenna. And from that point on, we have always thought everything together.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, because your question was, I ended a bit in a formula way.
Yeah.
I think you were targeting, you said the specific architectural consequences. That would be very, very interesting. What would be the architectural consequences of the networks made available by his systems? In other words, would something very different appear, if I understood that's what you're saying? Something very different and not so universalized. There is,
Mm-hmm.
the Mesian, that Mesian thing could be a bit of a nightmare, right? This endless horizontal.
Right. And also, his work is modulated through him.
Yeah.
At the end of, it's the Vaxman. And as you say, what would it be if multiple people started working on different parts of that flower, right?
Yeah.
In a way
Yeah.
that maybe his constructs of teaching started to get to, but
right.
was missing aspects of technology.
Right. I'm totally with you. And maybe implied in what you're saying is like, yeah, the problem is also that his way of thinking is connected into systems thinking, factory thinking, military thinking. Fuller also danced with the military, so loved by the hippies, but also loved by kind of a peacenik, but also loved by the military, right? So, and Fuller's defense was, military is just a name for collective intelligence. We put all of our intelligence into killing people. So if you really want to find intelligence, you go to the military. Constant Nieuwenhuis, who was very, very inspired by Waxman, like all of the others, imagines New Babylon as a place in which architecture is gone and all of us act out our desires through the computational networks and so on. And Waxman concluded after 20 years' work, after Vietnam War and after the abuse of a child of a friend of his, that humans are just horrific. And given this freedom to act on their own desires, we would kill each other very fast. And he spent 5 years drawing his project filled with blood. Right? Mm. So that's a kind of self-criticism. I don't see Waxman capable of that. Maybe because Constant was a painter pretending to be an architect, and only somebody pretending to be an architect could also walk away.
True.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I love the questions. See, that's what I mean by you grasp something about to happen. You grasp it, and it's exciting.
Could I jump in? Marcus, do you have more?
Yeah.
Not really a question, just maybe just a wandering thought. So I was thinking, not as I was listening to your talk, but at some point when I was swimming, it was like, wow, swimming feels so amazing.
Yeah.
Like, what is it? I don't have any real answers, but I kind of thought to myself, it's probably because in no other state do we have something touching our entire body all at once. Like it's a very particular kind of habitation.
Yeah.
Right? We are in something. We're almost consumed by something.
Yeah.
And the kinds of images that you showed, some of them, like the one that's behind you right now, are of that kind, right? That we are we are like
Yeah.
consumed by the space and the structure.
Yeah.
And then you zoom out, and then we see the Miesian horizontal. Like when we zoom out, we see the object, and we kind of the architecture, or we kick in as architects rather than as inhabitants or as swimmers.
Yeah.
And the same thing one could think about in relationship to TV, or in relationship to this electronic environment, which is that there is of course the object of TV, like the object of the horizontal, but we don't necessarily see the object. We are in the TV. That's when we are really consumed by the TV. And of course, between 20s, when the first TV you showed was invented, and now we almost can be consumed in those screens, and probably in another 20, 30 years, the object will go away, and we are very much in the screen. So as I said, it's not really a question, but just this the difference between being consumed and being in versus experiencing objects, both in the electronic environment, but also in the building environment.
Yeah. So I think very beautiful what you're saying. Of course, swimming, how can we talk about it in other than sort of psychosexual terms? Or is that my problem? In other words, I'm a bit scared to now join in what you're saying, because I might tell you what I think goes on in swimming. I remember, so let me try to avoid my own pathology, but I'm not going to succeed, right? But to swim is exactly like you say, that you are dependent on the water in you form a kind of a contract by which you sort of implausibly float. You know, perhaps that you are 95% water yourself. So it's water, a bag of water floating inside water. And this is the pathological part. I always used to like kind of lying without moving and just noticing that my body would float to the top. And the fantasy, the narcissistic fantasy, was that I floated more than other people. In other words, there's something about me which was, full of hot air, you might argue. And I always found that astonishing. And then I found it even more astonishing to do that in a river when you're moving through the landscape. So this sense that you give in to the water and you let the water guide you. So I think the swimming thing has these two dimensions. You make this interesting contract between your interior and the interior of the pool or the water. And then you could also choose the water to lead you. And a lot of the discourse about electronics is explicitly about the liquidity and flows and being with the flow and going with the flow and sometimes having to resist the flow. So all of that rhetoric is there, but not so much of the sexuality, not so much of the sensuality. And I think we have to consider the possibility that this swimming in information is a highly sensuous, delightful experience. And it's collective as well. I'm not even sure if sort of technically you can't swim alone, which of course brings me to the point that actually if you're swimming all the time, then you don't know that you're swimming. Fish don't have a concept of water until you remove them. If an old fish passes a young fish and says, "How's the water today?" the young fish is like, "The what?" Right? So if fish develops a concept of water if you take the fish out, then it goes, "I have a concept. Let's call it water, and I want to get back." So actually, what your environment is exactly that which you don't perceive. This is, of course, the basis of McLuhan's argument. The environment is exactly that which you don't experience. And he said that artists and architects have to produce anti-environments which make you see for the first time the world that you're already in. So when you pull back from the structure, you sort of see it more like an object. I started to think about it in a new way, because I thought, oh, well, okay, if you're right, then what you're seeing is a swimming pool. Right? And if I can look from the outside at the swimming pool, there's something, and of course I'm trying to put it behind me like I never get out, right? So I think this moment of being out and then returning, something like universities, right? Isn't that what we do in universities? You leave the so-called real world behind, not because you're disinterested in it, but you feel like if you get out of it, you can go back in differently. So if we are to think of a architecture of information and so on, maybe we have to be thinking of this gesture of being taken out of what you're already in. And I think you're already in radical, unbelievable, shocking kind of densities of information flow. So radical and shocking that we don't visualize them. We don't even want to visualize the communications network that we are swimming in. And that's the biggest artifact of our species, the single biggest object we've ever made, is the global communication network, which uses most of the energy, sustains most of the economies, sexualities, identities, and so on. And the best we've got is maybe a little cell phone antenna, right? So this effort we have, this effort to not see the world we're in, I think it's a great opportunity for architects to perform the role of artists and make an anti-environment. And then the question is a little bit like, okay, if you get back in, what do you get out? Now, I'm not a philosopher of swimming, but I think there'd be every reason to read, somebody that's brilliant about swimming, and I'm sure she would have us think differently about architecture. It's about atmosphere, right? You're never in a room. You're in an atmosphere in which you are constructing yourself continually. Like Mr. Fuller used to say when he would give a lecture, hey, I'm super happy to be back at Penn State. But of course, the only part of me that's come back to give a lecture are my glasses and my name, neither of which I was born with. So yeah, I'm Buckminster Fuller, but not a single part of me was here before. I'm a pattern, right? So if you start to think in these kinds of terms, it's pretty hardcore. What does it mean to be a swimmer that's dissolving while swimming, right? By the time you get to the other end of the pool, you're not the same as the person who went, right? Now that seems to be an annoying thing to think about. It's a way of drowning, probably, to think about it too much, but it's true. We're never the same. Remember the famous pre-Socratic argument that you can never step in the same river twice. We could add only one thing to that. You never put the same foot in there. And it's not your foot anyway. What makes you think it's your foot, right?
I think it's interesting that you've brought up the question of stepping outside of our environment in order to become aware of the environment. And if we're acknowledging the sort of electromagnetic field that we all live within as the environment in which we're all situated, that you're saying this all in what I think it's 2 days removed from all of Facebook's networks going down and people becoming viscerally aware of their own addictions. Yeah. They use Instagram and Facebook and so forth. And suddenly you what do? You dive right back in and start making memes about how addicted you are to Instagram. Yeah. Oh, I think it's a beautiful example. I thought you were going to go somewhere else. I just let you know my fantasy. Please. Isn't it interesting that over the last year we sort of did the reverse, that we actually all went into the media, and now we are meeting the analog world like it's something weird. Like this is the school, this is the studio, this is a class, this is a body. So in some ways, amazing lessons maybe were learned as we kind of got comfortable with our digital complexities. And now we go back to the analog, and we can see the analog in a way we couldn't see before. I love being with the students in the room, but once I'm in the room, I cannot avoid the thought that one of the students might kill me, because the student has very efficiently brought their networked, getting back to Elizabeth's point, brought back their sort of networked exchange of breath, of air, of an environment to me. So now I feel like I'm with the students in a room, but we're all very, very conscious of the fact that we are a kind of breathing animal, right? After a huge self-analysis of this country based on somebody who said, I can't breathe, like breathing, just the act, that's why I refer to breathing, right? The breathing, just what it means to breathe, what it means to understand that buildings breathe. They always breathe. If they don't breathe, it's a shitty building, right? So maybe, again, I'm just with this sort of glass that's pretty half full or whatever, that I would hate to think we disappear back into the university and then privilege the analog and think that the technological is some sort of prosthetic expansion of that. Seems to be the other way around. It seems like the so-called analog world is suspended within information networks and has been for a very, very long time. And that architects place objects inside networks and pretend that the network doesn't exist. Think of the suburban house. It only works as a suburban house if it's connected to vast systems of plumbing, so that your shit will make its way out towards some sort of purification plant, and water will come from some sort of lake, And when you make that transaction, when you sit on a toilet, you put your own plumbing in intimate contact with the plumbing of a building, plumbing which otherwise we don't want to talk about. You sit on a toilet, which is a piece of plumbing which breaks through the repression and presents itself to you as a seat. You sit inside the seat in order to make this transaction, but you certainly don't sit there, or at least I don't, maybe you do, and think, where did my deposit to the community? How is it moving? How fast is it moving? But if you're an architect, shouldn't you be thinking about that? So isn't this isolated suburban house with its little green lawn actually just the tip of the iceberg of a radical system of connectivity, which we are frightened by? By the way, the inside of that pipe that takes my shit out to the ocean, hopefully, is connecting to every other pipe in the neighborhood and all the neighborhoods so that everything goes to the same place, which means actually the little space inside the pipe, if I could put my finger in, that same space goes everywhere. So underneath the city is the biggest interior imaginable, like the lungs, like all these different capillaries, and we don't want to know it. And we call ourselves architects who make visible structure and make structure evident. Why is it that we ever got into this fantasy of the isolated building? Because we're so afraid of that stuff. So again, with the networks, can we find a discourse? And you're super right. I mean, just time out from Facebook and suddenly everybody becomes a philosopher. You know, I'm not on Facebook, so I was relatively unaffected, but I do appreciate that the entire universe stopped. I think a more radical experiment would be coffee. What if for 24 hours, no caffeine was available? I mean, planes would fall from the sky. I mean, Facebook architecture would stop, that's for sure, right? Our field is built on chemicals, right? So Facebook crashing, maybe it was not so hardcore. And if you're a conspiracy theorist, and why not? And certainly with Facebook, you better be. Is this a quote unquote accident? What is it exactly? I don't think there are accidents in information space. So I haven't analyzed it. I look forward to, Matthew, your analysis of what really happened.
It's pretty shallow, but
you know, when the lights go out in New York City, power cuts, earthquakes, you know, New Zealand, where I'm from, is an earthquake country. So when you're in an earthquake, you see the ripples. You see it going through a building like water in a pool. So that thing which you've lived with all your life, you see it like that. It's amazing. It's not a comfortable feeling, but it's so weird that you're sort of it's mesmerizing. So you suddenly realize, yeah, of course, architecture is on the move all the time. If it wasn't vibrating, it'd fall down. You know, yet another speech, yet another fortune cookie. This is a bad deal for Penn State.
Mark, there's a question in the chat that I'll read to you that tacks on to this. So one of our faculty, Denise Costanzo, writes, televised architecture has become so immediate because of the pandemic. We are all living in spaces of electricity, image, and information flow, yet more dependent than ever on protective barriers, walls and membranes that, however truly porous for physics, do separate our air from others in ways that matter. How do you see Wachsmann's and Einstein's visions playing out in that realm?
Yeah. Oh, this is a big one. A wonderful question and urgently relevant. Yeah, it turns out that this system of divisions that are so kind of recalcitrant and so supportive of inequities and hierarchies and so on, therefore call for being dissolved, are also necessary in a crisis of what might be called kind of radical exchange of information. If you think of the virus in DNA terms, the crisis here is how efficiently this information is being distributed. So if the classical role of architecture is to deny or sort of veil us from the knowledge that we sort of have buried in our heads, that we are literally suspended in this swimming pool, to use your image, of technology, that we are ourselves technological creatures hanging like by a thread, that we don't really stand on the ground. The ground is anyway full of wires and pipes and plumbing. We kind of pretend that we're on the ground, but we're really suspended in information. If architecture is traditionally the denial of that, very interesting in a health crisis, that some of the original reasons for those walls in the first place get kind of reactivated, and we return to this kind of policing. I think it's a beautiful question. I don't have much to add, although it's true that if you put up the walls in order to isolate yourself from the danger, ultimately you will be killed by the thing that you isolate yourself against.
like if children don't eat dirt, they die because they have lousy immune systems, right? So at some level, you have to take the danger in. The anti-vax army or armies doesn't want to take anything in that will change them, even if it means kill them, even if they would die as a result, because they can always pretend it was somebody eating babies in the evening that really killed them. So there's a kind of a remarkable sense in which not only what you said is true, but the limits of the human body have been kind of mobilized into a kind of political battlefield, such that wearing a mask destroys everything that Western sort of civilization has developed. Like, just to wear a mask, it's all gone. Your free will dominated by the government. It's amazing how fragile is this creature. And I think we have to be very, very scared of people that think of themselves as super fragile and super vulnerable, because they are not the people who are super vulnerable. They are not the people of color. They are not the laborers. They are the people that present themselves as the victims of this process. And so that they say, oh, I don't want the vax, and they don't want the mask. So they want to give you the disease in the hope that you're more likely to die if you're a person of color or a laborer. And you know what? You are. So it's not a stupid position. It's a sort of eugenic theory in which those that hold it believe in a number of them dying for the greater good, which is many more people, many more others dying. So this is like an incredibly elaborate answer to your question. But I think there's ways of thinking of the porosity and liquidity of architecture as also offering a kind of medical security, and would be more interesting to think. Just to take the obvious thing, if you go into a hospital, it's the hospital that's most likely to kill you. You're going to get a bug from the walls of the building. This has been true since Florence Nightingale. That was her original report in Constantinople on hospitals, that they kill you. So actually the safe, secure, isolated quarantine space is deadly, right? So we do have to think of another political model which enables, and it has been very, very interesting to see the architecture of the pandemic and what it means in kind of more obvious political terms. But, I told you, I'm happy to be with my students, but I'm also aware, notice how narcissistic, I didn't say I might give it to them, right? Me.
Well, Mark, thank you very much for your talk. It's been wonderful. It's been phenomenal to think about ourselves as this bag of microbes and water that nonetheless are capable of extraordinary things, for good and for bad. And again, thanks for this great discussion.
Thank you. It was really super generous to ask me, and I enjoyed it very much, especially the questions. Don't buy the book, by the way, because you heard the lecture.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks so much, Mark. Thank you for coming.
Bye-bye.
Too late.
See you.
Bye-bye.